Chapter 1. The Quiet Village of Emberley. There is a village, nestled quietly between the undulating hills of the English countryside, where the cobblestones remember every footfall, and the mist settles not as a weathered inconvenience, but as an old companion. The name of this place, known only to those who remember its charm, is Emberley. It is the sort of village that one does not stumble upon, but rather arrives at as though summoned. The trees bow slightly as if whispering among themselves, the cottages lean ever so imperceptibly inward, and the church bell, when it sounds, does so not with any sense of obligation, but with a kind of caution. A place seemingly immune to time, yet holding its breath all the same. At the heart of Emberley, like a story tucked into the middle of a well-loved book, stands Hemmings & Co., Rare Books, a shop of considerable age, whose wooden beams have darkened with decades of candle smoke and whispered confidences, whose display window reveals nothing of immediate commercial intent, but rather a careful arrangement of obscurities, faded first editions, inkpots of questionable origin, and the occasional glass dome encasing a moth-eaten page. Those who pass the window often do not look inside directly. Instead, they glance, just briefly before moving on. And though many in the village might smile politely at the mention of the shop, few have stepped inside without reason, and fewer still have stayed long enough to remember the smell, a dry, sour mix of vellum and varnish, tinged with something unplaceable, something faintly metallic, like the breath of old keys. It was into this quietly peculiar arrangement that Miss Jane Marple arrived, not as a tourist, nor even particularly as a guest, but as a friend fulfilling an old promise. She came, as always, dressed impeccably, with gloves too proper for June, and a mind far sharper than her gait would suggest. She had received a letter, quite plain, from Mrs. Aldwych, the vicar's widow, inviting her to spend a fortnight in Emberley, which Miss Marple accepted with neither hesitation nor fanfare. It had been some time since she had seen Mrs. Aldwych, and longer still since she had taken tea in the vicarage garden, where the blackbirds sang low and the roses climbed with a certain defiance. The train from Paddington had arrived late, and the only cab at the station had, as the driver said, gone north for the fair, but none of this troubled Miss Marple. She walked the remaining mile with her bag in hand, stopping once to adjust her hat, and once more when she thought, though only briefly, that someone had been following her. Of course the road was empty. Emberley did not rush. Mrs. Aldwych greeted her with the warmth of someone grateful not to be forgotten, though her smile wavered when she spoke of the village. "It's quieter now," she said, as they poured the tea, "quieter than it ought to be. And you remember Mr. Hemmings of the bookshop? Strange man. Well, stranger than before. He's taken to closing early. Says the light affects the paper." Miss Marple nodded but said nothing. She listened, as she always did, not to what was said, but to what lay just beneath. The village, she learned, had not changed in ways that could be named aloud. The butcher still sharpened his knives too loudly. The grocer's daughter had married a man from Cornwall, to the concern of no one except the grocer himself. And the children, they said, no longer played near the bookshop, not because they were forbidden, but because, as one mother explained, they found it unpleasant. The word hung in the air, unclaimed. The next morning, after toast and honey and a second cup of rather dreadful coffee, Miss Marple suggested a walk. The sun, she noted, was behaving well enough, and her joints were unlikely to hold out against the weather come Thursday. Mrs. Aldwych offered to accompany her, but Miss Marple declined. She wanted to reacquaint herself with the village on her own terms. She walked slowly, deliberately through streets that seemed unchanged, and yet felt compressed, as though the very lanes had shifted subtly inward. The houses bore their age with pride, but in the bookshop window, something had changed. The display, once a charming chaos of the forgotten and the collectible, was now obsessively ordered, every book equidistant, every label handwritten in identical script, every spine facing forward. In the centre stood a single tome, worn, leather-bound, without title. It seemed out of place, and yet precisely where it wanted to be. She stared for a moment, long enough to notice the reflection in the glass. Someone was watching her from the attic window. Not directly, not with the boldness of confrontation, but with the caution of someone who did not expect to be seen. A movement, nothing more. When she turned, of course, the window was empty. No face, no movement, only the gentle sway of a curtain too old to hold its own shape. Miss Marple made no remark, but she adjusted her gloves and continued walking. Later that afternoon, over a tea cake that had seen better hours, she casually mentioned the bookshop to Mrs. Aldwych. "Oh, they say he's collecting again," the widow replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Hemmings, I mean. Ever since that letter arrived, strange thing, came without a return address, said something about a book to be found. He's been peculiar ever since." Miss Marple asked what kind of book. "Didn't say, but he's been sorting the place obsessively. Closed the shop for 2 whole days last month, said he needed to catalogue, and he dismissed Clara, his assistant. Poor girl's gone pale as chalk." That night, Miss Marple sat by the window, looking out toward the village square. The lamp outside flickered, once, then steadied. Somewhere beyond, a dog barked, twice, and then fell silent. She rose, not out of impulse, but intention, and opened her notebook. One name, one date, and a single phrase. He was watching me. There was, it seemed, something unspoken about Emberley, something that sat just beyond the reach of polite conversation. The villagers did not gossip, at least not in the open, but there was a weight in their silence, a density that one could feel when the teacups were lifted and the conversation paused, just a second too long. Books, she thought, have a way of keeping secrets, and those who sell them, more so. And though it would be days before the full scope of the story began to unfold, Miss Marple had already sensed the change, not in the village itself, but in its posture, as though something had shifted just slightly, just enough to matter. There was, of course, more to come, but as Emberley slept, unaware or unwilling to speak of what had begun, Miss Marple remained by the window, her mind already turning the pieces over, not in suspicion, but in preparation. And as the church bell tolled once for the hour, far off in the distance, a shape moved behind the curtains of Hemmings & Co. Rare books, waiting, watching. Before we continue, if you found yourself drawn into this quiet web of questions, do consider subscribing. Our story is only just beginning, and what comes next may challenge everything you thought you understood about Emberley and those who walk quietly within it, because nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was. Chapter 2. The Bookshop Murder. Morning in Emberley does not begin with the chime of alarms or the hum of restless traffic, but with the cautious unfurling of curtains, the click of copper kettles, and the hushed rustle of newspapers folded twice, once for privacy and once for habit. The mists were slower to lift that day, as though reluctant to let the truth surface, and there was a peculiar hush in the air, as though the village itself were listening for something it could not yet name. Mrs. Aldwych had made marmalade, as she always did on Wednesdays, and the kitchen smelled faintly of orange peel and toast gone slightly too brown. Miss Marple stirred her tea with a patience born not of leisure, but of intention, and though she listened politely to the widow's account of church flowers and misbehaving hedges, her thoughts were elsewhere, on the flickering lamp from the night before, on the window with no watcher, and on the curious orderliness of a bookshop that had once embraced disorder as part of its charm. It was just after 10 when the first murmur reached them, carried not by words but by the tension that gathers when people cross thresholds without speaking. A boy ran past the gate, silent. Two women paused mid-conversation, glancing towards the square, and the postman, who usually paused for a biscuit, moved along without so much as a nod. Mrs. Aldwych opened the front door and Miss Marple followed, neither with alarm, but with that practiced readiness peculiar to women who have seen too much to be easily unsettled. A small crowd had gathered outside Hemmings & Co. Rare books, not large, not unruly, but wrong somehow, not in number but in purpose. The kind of gathering that speaks in hushes and avoids eye contact. The constable stood in the doorway, blocking it not out of authority but uncertainty. He was young, and his face betrayed the kind of confusion one does not yet know how to mask. He spoke to no one in particular when he finally said, "Accident, shelving collapsed." And just like that, the narrative began to build itself. Mr. Lionel Hemmings, owner and sole curator of Hemmings & Co., had been found beneath a fallen bookcase, his spectacles shattered, and a pool of ink, not blood, never that, staining the floorboards. The cause, they said, was simple enough: old wood, top-heavy volumes, a slip perhaps, or a lean too far. These things happened, especially in shops so laden with the past. But Miss Marple did not accept things merely because they were said often enough. She listened as others described how the books must have toppled, how Mr. Hemmings had been reshelving, how no one had seen him since the evening prior, and then she asked quite gently, what was he reshelving? There was no answer. Inside the shop, once the constable allowed her briefly past the threshold, she observed the scene with an eye trained not in forensics but in human behaviour. The shelf in question had not split, it had been pushed. The books lay not scattered, but aligned too neatly for chaos. And most curiously of all, the locked glass case, always sealed, always dusted, now stood open, its contents disarranged. All but one book remained. A space, just wide enough for a volume of modest size, gaped where once there had been no gaps. Miss Marple noted it, said nothing, and turned her attention to the clerk who had been called in to identify the body. Clara, young, withdrawn, with a face too pale for mourning, spoke with trembling precision. She had worked there for 2 years, catalogued the foreign titles, managed the ledgers. Mr. Hemmings had dismissed her 3 weeks prior, she said, though no reason had been given. She had returned only to collect her final pay. She had not expected to find the door ajar. The constable nodded, scribbled something meaningless, and moved on. Miss Marple watched Clara with quiet intensity, and when they were alone, briefly, beside the carriage post, she asked her what had been in the glass case. Clara looked at her, hesitated, and whispered, "He called it the book that remembers. I never saw the cover. He never let me near it." And then, with the smallest of shudders, she added, "It wasn't listed in the catalogue." Word spread, as it always does in villages like Emberley, not in shouts but in murmurs. The baker said the shop had been odd for months. The chemist recalled Mr. Hemmings speaking to someone who wasn't there. The vicar, with his habitual cough, mentioned the strange Latin phrases scribbled on receipts, and somewhere along the line the phrase emerged, "That shop has always been cursed." No one remembered who said it first, but they all repeated it. Mrs. Aldwych, for her part, maintained that Mr. Hemmings had never seemed quite right. She recalled over sherry that evening that he once refused to sell a book because it hadn't forgotten yet. When pressed, he had laughed, but not kindly, the laugh of someone who knows more than he ought. Miss Marple, who had seen many such laughs before, made a note of it. The inquest was scheduled without fanfare. The coroner, brought in from the county, declared the cause as consistent with blunt force and structural failure. No autopsy required, no suspicion warranted. But Miss Marple knew better. Bookshelves do not fall without reason. Books do not vanish without cause. And men like Mr. Hemmings, cautious, exacting, obsessive, do not die quietly beneath the weight of their own catalogues. She returned to the shop that night, long after the constable had locked it. She walked the perimeter, slowly, deliberately, and on the side wall, just behind the herb garden, she found it, a smear of ink. Not paint, not charcoal, ink, black and slick and fresh despite the rain. Someone had written something, then wiped it away. She scraped the residue with a gloved hand, placed the fragment into a paper envelope, and sealed it in her bag. In the morning, she would visit the rector's archives. She suspected she would not find what she sought, but absence too is a kind of clue. Later that evening, in her guest room, she unfolded her notes, drew a line between Mr. Hemmings, Clara, and the missing book. She circled the word remembers, and beneath it, in her careful slanted hand, she wrote what remembers and why. As Emberley settled once more into its fragile rhythm, the shop stood silent, sealed behind its leaded windows, casting long shadows into the square. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, waiting not to be found, but to be recognized. And recognition, Miss Marple knew, was far more dangerous than curiosity. Chapter 3. The Whispering Pages. There are certain sounds that do not announce themselves loudly, yet once heard cannot be forgotten. The creak of an old hinge that was silent yesterday, the sigh of wood that moves without wind, the faint shuffle of something behind the walls. Emberley had always been a village shaped by quiet, but now its quietude was changing, less a pause and more a hesitation, as though the village itself were holding something back. And those who listened closely could feel it, not in their ears, but somewhere deeper, in the way the air settled just before the curtains shifted, in the way even the birds near Hemmings & Co. had begun to avoid the eaves of the shop's sagging roof. Miss Marple, though by nature unassuming and unfailingly polite, was not a woman inclined to pass over questions simply because they were inconvenient. And so it was that, on the morning following Miss Hemmings' tragic and tidy conclusion, she made her way once again toward the bookshop, not to look but to listen, not to knock but to notice. The constable, young and easily discouraged by questions that required inference, had not returned since placing a cordon about the threshold, marked only by a loop of twine and an apologetic sign. It was, by all accounts, locked from the inside. Miss Marple stood before it now, gloved hands folded neatly, eyes not fixed on the door but on the windows above. Curtains hung limp, untouched by breeze or occupant, and yet something about their stillness, unsettled, more than disuse, not quite abandonment. She paced the perimeter once more, each step slow, methodical, her gaze drawn not to the obvious but to the neglected, the flower box missing one rotted nail, the back gutter dislodged from its fastening, and most notably, the faint outline of a footprint, half obscured by yesterday's rain beside the coal chute. A size too small for Hemmings, a heel too narrow. She returned then to the vicarage, where Mrs. Aldwych, unaware of anything but the jam burning on the stove, greeted her with distracted affection. But it was not tea Miss Marple sought, it was Clara. The young assistant had agreed, reluctantly, to come speak with her again, though she had requested the meeting be kept private. It was arranged then for the small sitting room by the east window, where the light was kind, and the shadows fell long. Clara arrived 15 minutes late, eyes red-rimmed and hair poorly pinned, her coat buttoned unevenly. She sat as one sits when afraid of hearing her own voice aloud. Miss Marple, ever gracious, offered her lemon water and waited. "You mentioned before," she began softly, "that Mr. Hemmings kept a book that was never catalogued." Clara nodded. Her fingers twisted the strap of her handbag. "He read it often. Late, after closing, he would disappear into the back room, lock the door, and I'd hear, yes, pages, turning, but not just turning, like they were talking, whispering." Miss Marple did not react, not outwardly. "Go on, child." "He spoke to it. I swear he did. Sometimes in English, but more often something else. I didn't understand. Did you ever see the book open?" Clara hesitated. Then, in a voice scarcely louder than the tick of the clock behind her, she said, "Once, by accident. I thought he had gone home. I came in to collect my coat. The book was on the desk, open. And the pages, Miss Marple, the pages were blank. The silence between them deepened, not empty, but watching. And yet," said Miss Marple, "he was reading aloud." Clara nodded again, and her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held something that could not be named easily. Fear, yes, but also a kind of recognition. Later that day, while Clara returned to her aunt's house and Miss Aldrich trimmed the geraniums with unnecessary vigour, Miss Marple took her walking stick and made her way toward the far edge of the village, where the schoolchildren gathered after lessons. It was there she encountered young Eliza Morgan, aged 10, fond of riddles and blessed with the inconvenient honesty of children. Eliza, when asked politely whether she had ever been near the bookshop after dark, did not lie. Her answer, in fact, came quite matter-of-factly. "We hear them, me and Alice, when we pass by." "Hear what, dear?" "Voices, in the walls, like reading. Sometimes it sounds like Mr. Hemmings, but sometimes it doesn't." Miss Marple paused. "And what do they say?" Eliza's brow furrowed. "Sometimes it's stories, but all broken, bits and pieces. Other times they just say names." "Names, yes, always the same ones, and sometimes mine." The girl offered this with the unbothered curiosity of youth, unaware of the chill it sent across the garden. Miss Marple thanked her, gave her a sweet wrapped in waxed paper, and returned to the vicarage with a mind no less sharp for its quietude. That evening, she sat once more by the fireplace, a shawl draped over her lap, and a lamp casting just enough glow to read by. But it was not the newspaper she perused. It was a volume she had recovered from the church's donation shelf, one that had gone unnoticed for years, its spine faded, its pages stiff with disuse. Its title, The Confessions of Gabriel Flint. She opened it slowly. The ink was irregular, handwritten rather than printed, and in a script that wavered between legible and arcane. It was dated 1871. The book claimed to be fiction, a fantasy, penned by a recluse whose estate had been auctioned off after his sudden disappearance. But the details, minute, obsessive, disturbingly precise, begged reconsideration. Descriptions of rituals, of encoded memory, of pages that could not be copied, and most peculiarly, a chapter on the remembering room. Miss Marple read it twice, and then a third time, just to be sure she had not misread the passage which stated, "Once the book remembers you, it cannot forget." There was no publisher listed, only a handwritten dedication, to the one who watched and waited. She closed the book gently, and placed it beside her teacup. The fire had burned low, and in the stillness, she thought not of Hemmings, not even of Clara, but of the bookshop itself, the structure, the space, the arrangement of the shelves. She retrieved her notes and began to sketch, and by midnight she had discovered something. The shop's layout, though seemingly chaotic, followed a pattern, not alphabetical, not by subject, but by reference. Every book corresponded to a line from Flint's Confessions. She had no explanation, not yet, but she did have a new question. If the book remembered, then who else did it remember? And more importantly, why? Chapter 4. The Second Death. It began, as such things often do in places like Emberley, not with a scream, nor with the sound of commotion, but with the quiet murmurs of early risers who came upon something they had not expected and did not quite understand. It was a boy who saw her first, the butcher's nephew, sent to fetch water from the stream that curled like a ribbon through the eastern field. His footsteps slowed as he approached the bank, and though he would later say nothing clearly, something in his expression lingered for days. What he saw, what they all eventually saw, was Clara, her hair darkened by water, her coat drawn tightly about her shoulders, her shoes gone. By the time the constable arrived, the villagers had already filled the gaps with what they knew, or rather what they feared. She had been walking alone, they said. She had been quiet. She had spoken nonsense to herself at the baker's stall, asking for change with her eyes fixed somewhere above his head. And then she had disappeared. No signs of injury were noted, no bruises, no scratches. Her bag, left neatly by the bank, contained only a notebook, wrapped in oilskin, and a single dried flower, pressed and flattened between 2 pages. It was the notebook that caught Miss Marple's attention. Clara's journal, as it turned out, was neither diary nor ledger, but something else entirely, an account, a confessional, and perhaps even a warning. The first pages were harmless enough, dates, times, petty grievances about weather and wages, but further in, the handwriting began to change. The ink darkened, the spacing grew irregular. They move when I'm not looking. The books, I arrange them, dust them, place them back, and yet the next morning they are elsewhere, not completely, just slightly wrong, as if they remember where they had once been. Miss Marple sat with the journal for nearly an hour, reading aloud to herself, softly, the way one might read a forgotten spell. Her eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in calculation. There's one in particular, brown leather, no title. He used to keep it under lock. Now it's always out. I hear it whisper. It stains my fingers. And then abruptly one line set off from the others, written in a hurried scrawl. They bled. The pages bled. The ink on that page had spread, unnaturally, as if soaked from within. Miss Marple returned the notebook to its oilskin and placed it gently into her satchel. There were things she understood instinctively, behaviours, patterns, compulsions, but this was something else, something quietly resisting explanation. Mrs. Aldwych, for her part, was shaken. She had liked Clara, though not intimately, and the idea of such a quiet girl walking herself into a stream unsettled her deeply. Over dinner, she speculated on melancholy, on the weight of recent events, on the unfortunate isolation of women without family. Miss Marple let her speak, all the while hearing something else. Clara had not seemed disoriented during their last conversation, disturbed, perhaps, but not confused, and more importantly, she had asked to meet again, alone. She had something she had not yet said. The next morning, after the police had filed their report and returned to the station house for tea and bureaucracy, Miss Marple left the vicarage without ceremony. She walked east, past the stone fence and the hollow where the sheep gathered, until she reached the small outbuilding by the churchyard, once the vestry, now a private residence. The man who lived there was not often spoken of in the village. He had gone blind some years ago, and with his sight, he had let go of most conversation, but Miss Marple remembered his name from her notes. Jonathan Yarrow, once a librarian. Long before Hemmings had acquired the shop, she knocked only once. The door creaked open. "Miss Marple," came a voice, brittle but steady, as if it had been expecting her. She entered. The room was dark, save for a small lamp. Books lined every wall, some stacked in corners, others laid open on the floor. The air smelled of wax, and something older, like air that had not been moved in years. "Mr. Yarrow," she said, "I've come to ask you about a book." He chuckled, but without humour. "You've come about that book." She did not answer. She waited. "I was there," he said after a long pause, "before Hemmings, when the shop still belonged to the family. I sorted the shelves, kept the logs. I was young and foolish and believed in the power of words, until I met that one. What happened? It opened itself. That's the only way I can describe it. You don't choose it. It chooses you." Miss Marple glanced toward one of the books near his elbow. "You don't mean literally?" He turned his head toward her, though his eyes were empty. "No, not literally. And yet, yes, it would appear when I was alone, sometimes closed, sometimes open to a passage I had never seen, and then it began to speak, not with voice, with memory, with ink. It wrote things I had not written, in my own hand, and then it stopped. When I left, when I lost my sight, it stopped entirely." Miss Marple considered this, and then asked, "Do you remember what it said?" "Only one thing," he replied. "It said, 'This page is waiting for her.'" She did not ask who. She already suspected the answer. Outside, the light had begun to fade. Emberley's fields turned amber, and the stream glistened coldly in the distance. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village square, her mind drawing lines between events, between books and girls and names said aloud in the dark. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 5. The book that wasn't there. There are discoveries which change nothing at first glance. Papers, names, details, relegated to dusty footnotes and forgotten ledgers. Yet when arranged with care, when viewed through a patient and curious mind, these fragments gather weight. And so it was with Miss Marple's next finding, which began not with revelation, but with the catalogue at the Emberley Historical Society, a catalogue few ever requested, and fewer still understood how to navigate. The room was quiet, narrow, and lit by slanting panes of glass, so old their imperfections distorted the daylight. It was here, amid brittle folders and faded ink, that Miss Marple found the first mention, almost as an afterthought, of a man named Gabriel Flint. Not a villager by birth, no, but by consequence, and not a figure spoken of proudly in the records. A marginalia man. A man whose presence was acknowledged, but never quite explained. The document was a handwritten census extract from 1870. In the margin, next to the entry Flint, G of private means, someone had added a question mark. Nothing more. She turned the page, then another, until she reached a maintenance log for a building no longer listed on modern maps. It had stood, the ledger noted, on the very parcel where Hemmings & Co. now resided, and beneath the log was an annotation in faint pencil, demolished in 1873. Occupant disappeared, site sold. Miss Marple copied the entry word for word. It was a thread, perhaps frayed, but not yet broken. That afternoon she returned to the shop, or rather, to what had once been its rear garden. The building remained locked, the constable's twine still in place, but Miss Marple was not there to enter. She had come to measure, not with tools, but with memory. The rear wall bore signs of age, not consistent with the front. Different stone, older mortar, and beneath the overgrowth partially buried beneath a fallen trellis, she found the remnants of what may once have been a boundary marker, a stone, waist-high, scored with symbols worn smooth by time. She took a photograph. There was something about the shape of the etching, not a cross, not a date, but something geometric and unsettlingly precise. That evening, after a supper politely refused, she wrote once again to her former colleague, Archibald Tuck, retired professor of esoteric antiquities, and something of an irritant in his younger years. His letters were always slow to arrive, but she knew he would recognize the design if anyone could. 3 days passed. During that time, Miss Marple walked the village without altering her routine, spoke to the shopkeeper about bread, nodded politely to the postman, and listened. Always, she listened. It was during one such outing, while reading in the church archive with her back to the light, that she found the obituary. It had no name. Local gentleman, age unknown, vanished under uncertain circumstances, property left unclaimed, house dismantled under parish order. The date was 1873. Below it, in smaller type, rumours of strange gatherings and the keeping of unnatural volumes contributed to local unrest. Unnatural volumes. The phrase hung in the air like a thread of smoke from an extinguished candle. Then, the letter arrived. Professor Tuck, writing in his maddeningly florid hand, confirmed the symbol. It was not a religious sigil, not a family crest. It was, he claimed, a memory cipher, used by certain 19th-century occult groups who believed identity was not fixed but cumulative, layered. He included a photocopy of an extract from a banned text entitled Codex Retentum, and in the margin, C. Flint, G. Case number 11. She found the referenced material buried in the university archives, in a folder not labelled by name but by number. There, amid faded clippings and scanned pages, was an illustration. It depicted a modest 2-story house with a gabled roof and ivy-covered stone, and next to it, a man, or the suggestion of one, drawn only in outline. Beneath the image, a caption, Gabriel Flint, alleged author of the book that remembers. Last confirmed location, Emberley. Disappeared. Believed buried on own land, no marker. Property sold. Shop erected Siebel 1. She stared at it for a long time. The book, the name, the house beneath the shop. That night she reviewed her notes, carefully laying out the timeline. 1871, Flint arrives. 1873, Flint disappears. 1874, shop built. Years pass, book resurfaces, then disappears again. Then Hemmings, then Clara. One truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her, but she was not yet ready to meet it. She needed one more confirmation, one final strand. And so she returned to the churchyard, where she met the groundskeeper, a man of few words and even fewer answers. But when she mentioned the possibility of an unmarked grave, Something flickered in his expression. He led her to the farthest corner of the grounds, where the boundary stones faded into the hedgerow. "There's one plot," he said. "No name, never claimed, no records, we don't touch it." Miss Marple stepped forward. The grass was uneven here, softer. The earth, when tapped with her cane, sounded different, less firm, less settled. She said nothing aloud, not then, but as she turned back toward the village, the wind shifted and carried with it a smell not quite like soil, not quite like stone, as though something had been waiting beneath, just long enough to forget it had been buried. Chapter 6. Locked Room, Open Mind. Narrated entirely in the calm, intelligent voice of a European gentleman, deliberate and precise, as though sorting through a long-forgotten drawer of facts and fragments, revealing each item not with drama, but with an understanding that true danger wears its quietest mask. In Emberley, locks are seldom questioned. They are placed out of habit, not fear, turned quietly in the evenings not to bar entry, but to acknowledge the day's end. Yet there are certain locks that once secured, do not expect to be tested again. Doors closed not just to keep people out, but to keep things in. The attic above Hemmings & Co. was such a door. It had stood untouched since the constable first reported the scene tidy, the ledger closed, the lights off, and the keys, so he had said, hung on a bent nail by the fireplace. And yet Miss Marple, who had made it her practice to look where others assumed no looking was necessary, believed otherwise. She returned to the shop with permission secured through quiet conversation and precise timing. The building had been shuttered since the day of Hemming's fall, and no one in the village, not even the constable, had shown much desire to revisit its corners. It was, as they muttered, best left alone. But Miss Marple was not one to leave things alone. The main floor was unchanged, the air dry with disuse, the dust settled unevenly, as though disturbed not by time, but by recent passage. She moved with care, her cane tapping gently across the wood, her eyes noting every irregularity, a stack of pamphlets misaligned, a curtain pulled half an inch too short, a ledger opened to the wrong page. She made her way to the back hallway, where a narrow staircase led upward at an angle so steep it seemed almost vertical. The door at the top was painted in a shade of green, now faded to olive, and though the lock had clearly not been forced, it gave way under the original key, one which she had found, quite inconspicuously, in a teacup on the third shelf, beside a mismatched saucer and a book of ghost stories. The attic was not dark. A skylight, obscured by cobwebs and soot, filtered in a thin grey light. Dust floated through it in lazy spirals. And yet, what struck her first was not the light, nor the smell, stale and faintly metallic, but the presence of warmth. A tea set sat on the small table near the fireplace. Not clean, used, one cup half full, still faintly warm. The hearth itself bore ashes that had not yet cooled, logs reduced to embers, smoke marks trailing up the back wall, and beside it a poker recently displaced. Miss Marple knelt, slowly, methodically. She touched the cup, warm, not hot but warm. She traced a finger along the rim, lipstick, barely perceptible. And then she saw it, a handprint on the inside of the attic window, made not with ink or paint, but soot, smudged, imperfect, left as though in haste or confusion. A right hand, small, possibly female. She turned back to the table and examined the surrounding floor. Footprints, 2 sets overlaid, one small. A drawer left ajar in the far corner revealed a stack of ledgers, aged, cracked, and unevenly bound, some pages torn, others replaced, dates ranging back decades. She opened the topmost ledger and began to read. Each page detailed an entry: name, date, duration of employment, role cataloguing assistant, translator, archivist, and alongside each name, a final notation: left position, unwell, resigned, disappeared. She flipped forward. The same phrases, again and again. 18 entries over 40 years. No clear pattern in age, gender or background, but all had been employed at the bookshop, and none remained. She paused at one entry: E. Morrigan, transcriptionist, 3 months, replaced by internal selection. In the margin, silence increasing, refused to speak final week. She placed the book down gently, her gloved hand resting on its frayed edge. There was no mention of Gabriel Flint, no entry under his name, and yet every entry bore something, an annotation, a hesitation, that suggested the same invisible hand. Below the ledgers, she found a small box, brass, locked. She did not force it. Instead, she made note of the engravings. 3 letters, GFR. She turned to the window. Outside, the village passed by, unaware, and yet here, in this narrow room, something was waiting. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. She left the attic slowly, returning everything to its place, though she pocketed one slip of paper found wedged between the floorboards. A passage, copied by hand from a book she had read only once, long ago. Flint's Confessions. It read, "The body forgets, the soul does not. We are merely the rooms we once occupied, and some rooms remain unlocked. As she closed the attic door, the floor beneath her creaked, not beneath her weight, but just after she moved. A delay, an echo. She stepped outside into the afternoon light, which now seemed slightly cooler, though no cloud had passed overhead, and as she walked back through the square, she felt it, a presence, not behind her, but beside, a second shadow, a pause in the rhythm of her own breath. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Before we continue, if you found yourself listening beyond curiosity, if you too sense that something in Emberley defies explanation, then do consider subscribing. Our journey is now approaching a threshold, and once crossed, there will be no going back. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Customer. The peculiar thing about memory is not what it remembers, but what it chooses to forget. A name mislaid, a face that slips through recognition like sand through fingers, a moment recalled only after it is no longer useful. In Emberley, such forgetfulness was rare. The village kept its memories as tightly as it kept its hedgerows, trimmed, deliberate, rooted deep. So when Miss Marple began to hear whispers of a visitor, a man none could name, yet all recalled with equal uncertainty, she listened with care. He had come to the shop, they said, the day before the shelving incident, wore grey, tall, polite, or perhaps not. Some said he asked for something specific, others said he said nothing at all. One shop assistant claimed to have seen him, but could not describe his face, only that she knew, with certainty, she had seen him somewhere before. Miss Marple collected these half-thoughts like coins from a well. Together, they painted not a portrait but a silhouette, a presence rather than a person. She did not speak of it openly, not yet. Instead, she visited the church. The Church of St. Hestia stood at the southern end of Emberley, its stone face weathered into something kindly. Inside, the stained glass windows refracted the light into pale hues, soft as breath, and the nave was lined with memorial plaques, each with a name long swallowed by moss and time. It was in the vestry, along a narrow corridor few ever entered, that she found it, a painting, small, faded, a portrait, the subject, a man seated, a book in his lap. He wore grey, his eyes pale, unsettlingly clear, stared not at the painter, but just beyond, as though something unseen had caught his attention. Miss Marple stared at it for a long time. There was no plaque beneath it, but in the lower corner, almost obscured by dust, was a signature, Gabriel Flint, 1872. She stepped back. The church remained silent. Even the light seemed unsure. She returned to the shop later that afternoon, this time with purpose. The constable had long since abandoned his post, and the keys were now held by the council. With gentle insistence and the firm suggestion of discretion, Miss Marple procured a copy. She did not go to the attic. She went to the back of the shop, to the history section. Rows of volumes stretching from local law to forgotten treaties, and behind one particularly tall shelf, slightly offset from the wall, she noticed a seam, not a door, a seam. She pressed, the shelf shifted, a click, a gap, and behind it, darkness. She entered, one step, then another. A narrow corridor, lined with boxes, led to a second room, windowless, square, walls lined with books, floor covered in layered rugs. At the center, a chair, a table, and upon it, a book, brown leather, no title. She did not touch it, not yet. The room smelled of age, but also of something else, something less easy to name, something kept too long, a stillness that felt deliberate. She circled the room. The books were not sorted alphabetically, nor by subject. They were arranged by annotation. Each bore a mark, a symbol, a variation on the cipher she had seen on the boundary stone. And then tucked into the corner, she found a file. Inside, letters, pages, fragments. The first was a note from Lionel Hemmings. I see him sometimes, in the mirror, in the reflections. I know he's watching me, but the books won't stop. They keep talking, keep remembering. Another, unsigned. He was here, yesterday. Same coat, same smile, but younger, or older. I don't know anymore. And finally, a photograph, old, sepia-toned. The bookshop, but not as it is now. Smaller, rougher, with a man standing at the entrance, worn shoes, long coat, hand resting on the doorframe. The face, she recognized it. The man in the portrait, the man no one could describe. She placed the photograph down. The silence pressed closer. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 8. Madness in the Margins. There are many kinds of silence. The silence of dusk in a village whose residents have all gone inside. The silence of a page not yet turned. The silence of one's own thoughts as they begin to edge beyond what is comfortable. For Miss Marple, a woman not prone to distraction nor to imagination, the silence that crept into her mind in the days following her discovery of the hidden room was of an entirely different character, subtle, uninvited, and terribly persistent. It began with the sound of pages, not real pages, not those she turned in front of her. No, this sound came from elsewhere, too faint to pinpoint, too persistent to ignore. It followed her through the vicarage, across the garden, and once, even into the church. Paper moving against paper. A slow, deliberate rhythm, not blown by wind, but manipulated, turned, and with it came the whispers. Not voices, precisely. She could never recall what they said, only that they said something. Names, perhaps. Questions, reproaches, or memories. And sometimes, only sometimes, she thought she heard her own name. She did not speak of it at first. Not to Mrs. Aldwych, whose arthritis had flared, nor to the constable, who had returned to his former duties and now avoided the bookshop entirely. Instead, she made notes. Quiet, meticulous entries in a small leather-bound diary she had kept since 1942. The same diary in which she had documented the trial of the Linthorpe poisoning and the affair of the missing lithograph in Brussels. She trusted that diary. It did not exaggerate. The entries began as observations. Heard movement in upper room. No one present. Fireplace cold. 7:03 a.m. Dreamt I was reading a book written in my own hand. I do not remember writing it. And then they became stranger. Unable to locate volume on shelf this morning. Reappeared 2 hours later. Smell of burnt wood near entryway. Her own behavior too began to shift. She found herself walking the same paths more than once without realizing it. On one occasion she returned to her room to find the bed turned down, though she had made it already. Mrs. Aldwych denied any involvement. More than once she awoke with the sense she had been speaking aloud in her sleep. She did not mention this to anyone, but she began placing a slip of paper beside her bed, with a pencil resting on top. One morning, the pencil had moved, and the slip bore a word she did not remember writing. Remember. The village, meanwhile, had begun to change. Not visibly, but in tone. The children no longer played near the square. Their laughter had dulled, replaced by quick glances and whispered warnings. Adults too walked faster past the bookshop. Conversations ended more quickly, and at the bakery, where gossip usually bloomed like yeast, there was a different mood, one that kept voices low and eyes averted. "I've had the most peculiar dreams," said the florist one morning, unbidden, as Miss Marple passed. "Me too," murmured the butcher's wife, who had overheard. "Books, always books, talking ones." "Names," added the postmaster. "I hear my name, in the middle of the night." Miss Marple did not reply, but she made another note. The whispers were spreading. She returned once more to the hidden room, this time with a lantern, gloves, and a mirror, the old silver-backed one from her own vanity, which had never failed her in 30 years. She placed it flat on the table, next to the book, and waited. For a time, nothing happened. She read. She listened. She studied the symbols in the ledgers. But just as she prepared to leave, the air changed. Not colder, nor warmer, but charged, as if the room itself were holding breath. And then she heard it. Her name, whispered, from behind her. She turned. No one. But in the mirror, the faintest outline of a man in grey, just behind her shoulder. She did not move. She did not blink. And then he was gone. She returned to the vicarage. Her thoughts sharper now. The time for doubting herself had passed. This was no matter of fatigue, nor of age. Something was happening in Emberley. She returned to her notes, to Flint's book, to the records. And finally, she found it, in the margins of an untranslated section of the Confessions. A passage, once dismissed as metaphoric nonsense, but now, with new context all too clear. It is not memory that fades. It is the mind that rebels. Through fire and ink, the soul may be impressed. Repetition, ritual, and the unwritten name. Thus may the self be passed from flesh to flesh, page to page. Memory transfer. She read it again, then a third time. It was not reincarnation, not quite possession, something in between. A book, created not to tell a story, but to carry it. A vessel. And if Flint had succeeded, if the book had remembered him, and if he had remembered how to return, then Hemmings may not have been its last reader, nor its last host, and the names whispered at night, they weren't warnings, they were invitations. She closed the book. Her hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from recognition. The clues had been scattered, deliberate, and yet they had all pointed here. The margins, the pages no one read, the forgotten corners.
Chapter 9. The Memory Ritual. There are rituals one performs daily, without thought, setting a cup beside the kettle, drawing curtains at dusk, folding the same scarf in the same drawer. But there are other rituals, older, slower, more precise, which do not pass from generation to generation by custom, but instead slip quietly through the cracks of history, waiting to be rediscovered by those who know not to look too directly, but merely to remember. It was in the narrow confines of the hidden room behind Hemmings & Co., beneath the dim flicker of the lantern and the uncomfortable stillness of the air, that Miss Marple at last turned to the final section of Flint's Confessions. The ink here was darker, less even, the script narrower, as though written in haste, or else with increasing obsession. A change had occurred in the tone, less scholarly, more urgent. The passage began simply. The flesh forgets, the mind resists, but memory, properly planted, can persist across the dying of form. The page does not remember for itself. The book does not awaken on its own. It must be seeded. She read on. Memory seeding, the act by which the soul, fragmented but whole in intention, may be impressed upon written form, and in turn impressed upon the reader, whose thoughts upon reaching a particular configuration allow for re-entry. Her eyes had not deceived her. This was not metaphor, not allegory. Flint had not written fiction. He had recorded a process. She flipped through the pages. Each one detailed methods of transference, not merely psychological, but metaphysical, symbols to be replicated in margins, incantations not spoken aloud, but thought rhythmically, phrases intended to rewrite memory. She found notes tucked between the pages, old, creased, possibly from Hemmings. Recitation complete, no result. Second attempt required. Increased frequency of whispering. Book no longer cold. Another, less steady. Pages turned on their own. Twice. Candle extinguished. Must not continue without precaution. Miss Marple had read hundreds of case files. She had seen minds unravel and motives twist upon themselves, but what she read now was not madness. It was method. The steady, careful descent of a man convinced he had found a way to live beyond the end. Gabriel Flint had not disappeared. He had attempted to return, and if she understood correctly, he had done so through the book, through the act of remembering, through the act of reading. And Hemmings had read. Clara had read. She herself had read. She steadied her breath, focused her thoughts. This was not a moment for imagination. It was a moment for deduction. She returned to her notes. The pattern was clearer now. Each time the book had surfaced, each time someone had disappeared, or changed, or heard whispers, the timeline aligned with new contact. The book did not act alone. It required a reader. It required recognition. The man in grey, the forgotten customer, was not simply a witness. He was a continuation, a vessel, and if Miss Marple's suspicion was correct, the ritual had not yet been completed. Something had interrupted it. Hemmings' accident, Clara's withdrawal, the unmarked grave beneath the shop. The memory, seeded, had never fully grown. Until now, because now, she thought, the book has remembered, and I am remembering it. She moved to the table in the center of the hidden room. The mirror she had placed earlier now reflected only her own face, but for a brief second, as she leaned forward, it showed something behind her shoulder, a figure, barely formed, then gone. She did not flinch. Instead, she reached once more for the brown leather-bound book, and this time turned to the page with the most annotations, lines in pencil, lines in ink, some scratched out, others underlined thrice. The final passage read, "When the reader forgets themselves, the memory enters. One mind must empty, one must fill. Names hold power. Repeat the true name, and the door will open." The true name, Flint's name. She rose from the table. The room remained silent, but the silence wasn't empty. It was watching. In the days that followed, Emberley continued on the surface. Children played again, though less loudly. The baker opened early, though he seemed to forget his prices. And Miss Marple, always punctual, now found herself waking before the hour, as if something had shifted in her sleep. Once, she found herself writing before she had even risen fully, notes in the margin of her diary, notes she did not remember writing. Each entry bore a name. Gabriel Flint, again, and again. She did not panic, but she grew cautious, and in the dusk of that following Thursday, she returned to the church. There, in the vestry, she examined the portrait once more, and this time, she recognized something, a small blot of paint near the corner. Not age, not damage, a symbol, the same cipher from the ledgers. The man in the portrait was not simply Flint, he was Flint remembered, impressed, embedded. She turned to leave, the pages of the diary in her pocket fluttering slightly, as if catching a wind that did not move. She did not look back.
Chapter 10. The False Past. The past, once recorded, is expected to remain unchanged. A newspaper clipping yellowed by time, a photograph in a frame, a name on a parish record. But what if the records disagree with the memories? What if slowly and without fanfare, the past rewrites itself, not with violence but with quiet insistence? Miss Marple did not often visit the Emberley archives twice in the same week, yet by the fourth morning following her last visit to the hidden room, she was back again, seated at the same narrow desk in the reading alcove, surrounded by the same careful silence that cloaked the shelves like lace. Her aim was no longer to discover who Gabriel Flint had been. That much she now knew too well. Instead, she was seeking something altogether more delicate, evidence not of what was, but of what had changed. She began with the local newspapers. Emberley's Post and Clarion, an unassuming publication, had run weekly for more than a century. The earlier editions, thin and meticulously typeset, carried stories of harvest yields and minor thefts, missing cats, annual fates. But here, in the issues surrounding the year 1873, she found gaps. Not blacked-out articles or torn pages, nothing so dramatic, but patterns, names that should have appeared more frequently, mentions that vanished. There was an obituary for a child who drowned in the Emberley stream. Only the date was incorrect.
The schoolhouse logs suggested the girl had returned the following term. In another article, a couple who reportedly left the village for Yorkshire were still recorded as living there 10 years later. And most curiously, the name of a librarian, Jonathan Yarrow, now blind, still remembered, did not appear at all until 1874, though he claimed to have worked there in 72. She cross-referenced census entries, employment rosters, electoral registers, and with each point of inconsistency, she felt not confusion, but confirmation, a network of alterations, small, subtle, enough to dismiss individually, together, unmistakable. The past had been touched, or perhaps remembered differently. She returned to Hemmings & Co. that afternoon. The constable had long since abandoned the notion of guarding it, and Miss Marple moved quietly beneath the archway and into the familiar gloom. Dust lingered, footsteps did not echo. She made her way to the back section, History and Antiquities. From the shelf she pulled 3 volumes, not to read, to examine. Each had marginalia, pencil marks, underlinings, commentary in a hand she now recognized, Lionel Hemmings. On the inside cover of a 19th century guide to English ruins, he had written, "I see it again, the fire, the screams, I wasn't always Hemmings." In another, "Pages bleed when no one's watching, ink seeps backward, memory fills the cracks." In a third, "He stands outside the shop each evening, same face, no longer mine." Miss Marple closed the books gently. These were not the thoughts of a madman, nor, strictly speaking, of a man at all. They were traces, residual impressions, memories belonging to a consciousness not entirely his own. The book had not merely transferred knowledge, it had reactivated memory, and if that was true, if Gabriel Flint had discovered how to seed not only his thoughts but his past, then those who came into contact with the book might begin to remember things not from this life, but from lives lived before, or alongside, or intended. A conduit, that was the word she had once dismissed, but now she considered it fully. What if the shop, built on the ruins of Flint's house, its foundation unknowingly structured over his ritual site, was not simply haunted in the traditional sense, but aligned in such a way through books, symbols, presence, that it allowed for certain impressions to persist? She examined the floorboards, measured the ceiling beams. It was not architecture by coincidence. The placement of the shelves matched the pattern found in one of Flint's rituals, a memory maze, a circular path, a structure to guide the wandering mind. And she too had wandered. She had forgotten names lately, confused days, written down things she did not remember thinking, and more than once she had dreamed of fire, not an imagined blaze, but a memory, hers or someone else's. A library engulfed, screams echoing down narrow corridors, a man's voice repeating a name, not hers, but familiar. She stepped back from the shelf, her gaze drawn upward. The ceiling above the history section sagged slightly, uneven, as if bowed beneath weight, and then she remembered, the attic, directly above, where the teacup had still been warm, where the mirror had caught the figure in grey, the man who no one remembered, because he had not been fully remembered yet, because the ritual had not completed. She made her way slowly back to the front of the shop. The light through the windows was weaker now. Evening had crept into Emberley, soft and unannounced. The vicar's widow would be setting tea, children would be called inside, but here, in the shop, time felt paused. She reached into her bag and removed the diary. The page for today was already marked, words written in her own hand, but not in her own voice. I remember now, the fire wasn't mine, but the words were, and beneath it, names must be spoken, memory must finish what it began. She closed the diary, locked the shop behind her, and returned to the vicarage, where the curtains had already been drawn. Chapter 11. Pages from the Dead. It began, as most things do, with a decision that felt ordinary. Miss Marple stood once more at the door of Hemmings & Co., the heavy brass key cold in her hand. The morning air in Emberley had taken on a damp chill, though there was no wind to move it, no weather at all really, just a stillness that pressed close. She stepped inside. The shop greeted her, not with silence, but with a kind of expectant hush. She moved without hesitation to the hidden room. There, beneath the weight of its quiet, she opened the leather-bound volume and turned to the final portion of Flint's writings, pages torn from their binding, folded and hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer. They smelled faintly of char. The missing chapter. Her fingers hesitated over the text, but only for a moment. She read aloud. The words, ritualistic, rhythmic, were not dramatic. They did not chant or command. They simply described memory as echo, memory as invitation. The past, not locked behind time, but pressed softly into the present, like ink beneath parchment. As she read, something shifted. Subtle, at first. The books along the wall no longer stood quite where they had. One leaned differently. A spine now read in Latin. A volume that had been blue was now grey. The lamp flickered not as a flame does, but as if the light itself were uncertain. A sound, a low creak, perhaps a sigh, came from above, though no footstep followed it. Miss Marple's voice did not waver. She continued. The chapter described a completion of pattern, a moment when recognition joined repetition, when the reader not only understood but remembered names, events, rooms that had once burned, a face at the door, a door that should not have opened. And then, the text stopped. A blank page, no ending, only space. She closed the book, and the room held its breath. She turned to leave, but the door, once ajar, was now shut, not locked, just closed. She opened it, returned to the main shop floor. There too, things had changed, subtly, precisely. A table had shifted 6 inches to the left. A lamp that had never worked now glowed. A photograph of Mr. Hemmings behind the counter stared not ahead, but to the right. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. She approached the desk. Beneath the ledger drawer, something new, a letter, handwritten, addressed simply, to whoever finds this. She unfolded it. I tried to bury him, but the book remembers. We burned the house, we scattered the pages, but memory isn't held in wood or ink. It's in thought, in the turning of a page, in the space between words. He returns when he is remembered, and now he is remembered again. Signed, Lionel Hemmings. A sound, a light shuffle from the attic. She did not move toward it. She sat instead at the desk, let the letter rest beside the diary, and closed her eyes. For a moment, just a moment, she was no longer in the shop. She stood in fire. Not of this time. A boy's voice screamed from somewhere beyond the shelves. Hands reached for her, a different her. A man with grey eyes turned, spoke a name that was not hers, but answered just the same. Then silence, and she was back in the shop. The books were still, the air, unmoved, but something was different now. She had read the words, she had remembered, and something else had remembered her. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 12. The Night of the Red Ink. Emberley had no history of storms worth naming, yet on that night the wind howled as though it had found something to answer. Not a gale, not even a downpour, just a strange kind of storm. The sky turned grey by late afternoon, and the clouds appeared not to gather, but to hover, unusually low, as if observing the village below rather than covering it. It was the vicar's widow, Mrs. Aldwych, who first remarked it aloud. "Feels like something's watching, Jane," she whispered, fingers curled tightly around her shawl. "The sort of weather my mother used to say was borrowed." Miss Marple said nothing. She had already packed her bag. She had known she would return to the shop before the end, not to investigate, not even to understand, but to be present for something she could not define, though her heart beat with the rhythm of inevitability. Word had reached her, subtly but unmistakably, that the man in grey had been seen again by 3 different people. A child who said he stood behind the garden gate and never blinked. An old woman who swore she'd seen him through her kitchen window, though no footprints marked the mud outside. And the grocer, a practical man who refused to speak of it at all, only closed his shutters at midday and said nothing more. The moment the wind turned, Miss Marple and Mrs. Aldwych walked together to Hemmings & Co. There were no lights on in the shop, but light glowed from inside regardless, a glow not of oil or electricity, but something more like reflection, the kind of light a mirror gives when it remembers a face. Miss Marple unlocked the door. They stepped inside. The bell above the frame did not ring. The first thing they saw was red, not blood, though the instinct was similar. Ink, deep and fresh, poured into a basin at the centre of the floor. Surrounding it, 5 books carefully placed, their spines aligned inward, each a different title, each one of them presenting the dream Miss Marple had nearly forgotten. On the walls, chalk marks, geometric, arcane, mathematical, yet more than that. They weren't written in haste. Each stroke appeared rehearsed, as if someone had copied them from memory. Candles lit themselves in the mirrors. Mrs. Aldwych stopped breathing for a moment, but Miss Marple took a step forward. She looked down at the titles. English Folklore, Vol. 3, where the story of Gabriel Flint had first been footnoted. The Confessions of Gabriel Flint, of course. The Emberley Parish Registry, 1841, Thrandard, 1890. Practical Memory and Symbolic Mnemonics, author unknown. And the book without margins, a blank leather volume that, curiously, had never been seen on the shelves until that moment. 5 books, 5 points, and in the centre, red ink, unstirred, as though it waited. There was movement above. They ascended the stairs, slowly. The attic door stood open. The fireplace was lit, warm again, though no firewood lay within. On the wall, pages had been tacked, torn from different books, diagrams, words. One said simply, "I remember." Another, "Repeat until real." A third, "Memory completes what time forgets." And then a sound, not a voice, but a whisper. The pages turned themselves. Books opened on the desk, one by one, as if leafed by invisible hands. Pages fluttered, not in panic, but like breath. Then silence. Miss Marple approached the fireplace. There, inside the hearth, a mirror, cracked, and in its reflection, a man in grey, but not in the room, only in the glass. He stood with his back to her, then turned, and though she could not place the face, her breath caught, because he did not smile, did not speak. He simply nodded, as if they had already met, long ago, and she had at last remembered his name. A gust of wind blew through the house. The candle flames tilted, but did not extinguish. Mrs. Aldwych, her hands trembling, whispered, "Jane, what is this?" Miss Marple did not answer. Her gaze fell to the desk. A page, a final note, dated with yesterday's date, though the handwriting was older. "Begin again. Remember, ink and ash, fire and name. He does not need to return, only to be recalled." She placed it in her pocket. Downstairs, the ink had begun to stir. There was no source, no wind, and yet it rippled, not outward, but inward, toward the centre, as though being drawn toward something beneath. Chapter 13. Rewriting the Past. When Miss Marple returned to her lodgings that night, the wind had ceased, but the stillness that followed it was heavier than any gale. Mrs. Aldwych did not sleep. She sat in her parlour, eyes unblinking, a cup of tea untouched, her fingers resting on the fabric of an old prayer book as though to steady her thoughts with its spine. Outside, Emberley breathed in silence, but within that silence, something moved, and Miss Marple knew now it was not new. It was old, painfully old. The following morning, with a new clarity, she began her task not in the bookshop, but in the village archive, a building rarely visited and seldom dusted, yet protected from change by a town clerk who fancied himself a curator of forgotten truths. She asked for census records, registry logs, obituaries, births, and she found them. Names too familiar. People she had met in the village over the past days, shopkeepers, farmers, the postmistress, even the boy who watched her from the school gate. Names that did not quite match, but echoed, like reflections in moving water. She laid out the documents on the table. A pattern began to form. A cluster of names dated to 1872, a decade drenched in occult fascination, and at its heart, Gabriel Flint, not merely a recluse, a figure of influence, a man who gathered followers, a society, not in open ceremony, but beneath the surface, through memory, through ritual, through the promise of what he called the Red Record. He had convinced them, his followers, that the soul could be anchored, that it could be passed not through blood, but through memory, that ink could do what flesh could not. A ritual he called memory seeding, in which recollection itself became the thread by which the soul might move forward. The fire had interrupted it, but had not ended it. And Miss Marple, now hunched over these old clippings, understood that Mr. Hemmings had never truly uncovered Flint's book. He had been part of it, a page within it, inked into it. His own notes, scrawled in margins and ledgers, took on a new meaning. "I wasn't always Hemmings. The fire wasn't the end. He waits in the white space." These were not the ravings of a man unravelling. They were annotations. She walked back through the village, seeing it anew. People moving with a quiet, uncanny rhythm, repeating greetings, asking the same questions. A woman in a floral shawl who always stood at the same corner. A man who fed the birds in patterns, clockwise, then counterclockwise. She remembered their faces, from portraits in the church, and now she knew why. These were not descendants, they were echoes. The ritual had not brought Flint back alone, it had brought them all. Or rather, it had preserved them, fragment by fragment, page by page. The books had become a conduit, not of spirit, but of memory, and with every page turned, every line read, those echoes grew sharper. Marple returned to the shop. She opened the ledger again, turned to the first page. The ink had faded, but beneath it, newer lines had appeared, written in a hand both old and trembling. The ritual was never murder, it was preservation. The sacrifice was the ink, the vessel was the word. He was interrupted. "He is not finished." She ran her finger across the words. They felt warm, a sound, like books closing in unison. The air shifted, and there, in the far mirror, the man in grey stood once more, but this time his eyes moved, and in them, recognition. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching, and she realised the ritual had never required belief, only memory, and she...
Chapter 14. The Final Page. It was not dawn when Miss Marple stepped once more across the threshold of Hemmings & Co. Rare books. It was earlier than that, darker, colder. The hour when night holds its breath, as though uncertain whether to yield to the day. She carried a single item with her, a matchbox, and within her handbag, folded with care, the letter from Hemmings, a small bottle of kerosene, and the brass key to the attic, which had been found nestled inside a hollowed-out Bible in Mrs. Aldwich's sitting room, a book no one had touched in years. The door creaked open with less resistance than expected, the air inside warmer than the street outside.
unnaturally so, as if someone had lit a fire hours before and then let it breathe into the bones of the shop. No sound, no wind, yet a presence. She moved slowly, her footfalls muffled by the thick carpet of dust and discarded receipts. Light from the single gas lantern in her hand cast long shadows, bookcases leaning like silent sentinels watching her, their titles unreadable, their purpose no longer literary. She paused before the hearth. Once she had admired it, a feature of English craftsmanship, Victorian in design, iron-barred, elegant. Now it felt like a mouth. She poured a careful line of kerosene along the floorboards, between the shelves, under the threshold, around the hearth, and up the ladder that led to the attic. She did not rush. This was a ceremony now, though she would never call it that. And then in the exact centre of the shop, upon the table once used for reading group teas and bibliophile luncheons, she placed the book, the one Hemmings had hidden, the one with no title, the one bound in leather smooth as glass, warm to the touch, heavier than it should be. She opened it to the first page. There were no words, only ink, dark, dense and freshly dried, and as she turned each page, the temperature in the room dropped. Not by wind or weather, but by memory. The room was remembering itself. From the fireplace came a sigh, then a voice, not from outside, not from within, from the margins, and then he was there, the man in grey, no longer at a distance, standing in the shadow beside the globe, still as a figure in wax. And yet this time, something had changed. His eyes followed her, slowly, and with purpose. She did not move, did not cry out. Instead she whispered one name, Gabriel. His lips curled, just barely, enough to suggest familiarity, or triumph. She struck a match, the flame bloomed orange against the paper, and he took a step forward, just one. No more were needed. She tossed the match into the circle of kerosene. The flame caught quickly, hungrily. It swept across the floor, up the bookshelves, curling into the air like a rising signature. The man in grey remained still, then his form flickered, once, twice, and in the third flicker, he was no longer flesh, he was ash, and then nothing. The fire roared. Marple turned from the flames, eyes watering, not from fear, not from smoke, but from the weight of recognition. As the shop consumed itself, beam by beam, book by book, the sky outside began to lighten. Not blue yet, only less dark, enough to shape the village rooftops against it. Hours later, when the fire brigade arrived, and the last embers hissed into silence, they found little left but scorched timber and stone. Yet among the rubble, near what had once been the reading table, sat one book, unmarked by flame, unopened, its pages blank, except for one, and upon that page in the centre, written in the same hand Hemmings had used, "Remember me." Chapter 15, a quiet ending. It began, as these things often do, not with thunder, nor flame, nor the piercing cry of reckoning, but with silence. The kind of silence that is too complete to be ordinary. The kind that presses itself against the glass panes of a window left ajar, heavy and waiting. And in the village of Emberley, now touched by the first hesitant breath of autumn, that silence was everywhere. In the way leaves no longer rustled quite as freely, in the hush of shopkeepers who now lingered a moment longer before unlocking their doors, in the soft, deliberate way conversations faltered when one spoke the name Gabriel. The shop was gone. Where once stood Hemmings & Co., rare books, a building as tired and time-worn as the stories it held, there was now only a blackened patch of earth, the stone foundation charred at its edges, a curled remnant of wall reaching skyward like a forgotten question. The fire, they said, had been accidental, old wiring, a candle too close to paper. No one asked too deeply. The villagers, those still in Emberley, kept their eyes forward, but they passed the empty lot faster now, and none stepped near after sundown. Miss Marple, never one to linger unnecessarily when the air turned colder and the facts grew scarce, had extended her visit by precisely 1 week. It was not due to illness, nor to comfort. Mrs. Aldwich's guest room, while warm, had never truly been kind to her spine, but rather something unspoken, something unfinished. Each morning she would sit by the vicar's widow with her knitting, her eyes drifting often to the garden path as though expecting someone to arrive. Each night she would dream, always the same dream, the old shop still standing, the bell over the door tinkling not once but twice, the scent of scorched parchment in the air, and a book bound in black, gold etched at the corners, pressed to her hands. This time, though, in the final dream of her final night in Emberley, she was not handed the book, she was holding it already, and the fire had not yet come. She woke before dawn, fingers aching with a tension that had no physical cause, and stood silently at the window. The fields beyond the village were steeped in fog, mist clinging low like breath held in suspense. Emberley was returning to stillness, to something that looked from the outside like peace. But in her heart, Miss Marple knew, peace is not always the absence of noise. Sometimes it is only the eye of the storm. And so, as she folded her garments neatly into her valise, checked the buttons on her travel coat, and paused to gather the folded newspaper clippings one final time, a quiet decision was made. There would be no further investigation, no written report, no call to London. The case, as far as the outside world would know, was closed. But for her, there was one last task. It happened at midday. The logo on its side bore no name, only a gold quill across a leather-bound spine. A new shop was opening, they said. Not another grocer, nor a boutique, but another bookshop. The irony did not escape her. The villagers smiled, but the smiles did not reach their eyes. And Miss Marple, watching from beneath the brim of her travel hat, observed without comment as boxes were carried in, stacked, unpacked, shelved, and the shop took form where no shop had stood before. By evening, the bell above the new door rang for the first time. It was a gentle sound, familiar, almost comforting, almost. Inside, the shelves were new but smelled old, the lighting soft but precise, and the proprietor, a young man with a voice like brushed velvet, welcomed patrons with a quiet nod. The name above the entrance, the archive, nothing more, and it might have ended there uneventfully had it not been for one particular shelf. Tucked in the far corner beneath a sign reading Occult and Esoterica, a single volume rested at an angle just askew enough to catch the eye. Its cover was blank, no title, no markings, no author, but open it, and on the inside front page, neatly, precisely, in ink black as pitch, was written only this: The Return of Gabriel Flint. Miss Marple did not see it. She had already boarded the train. Her eyes were closed as the wheels turned on the tracks, but as the sun sank behind the hills of Emberley and the book sat silently among the others, a breeze stirred the page and turned it. The next page was blank, then another, and another, until on the final leaf scrawled in the same hand was one more sentence: Books don't forget, they wait. And behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. The train moved steadily now, rocking gently as it passed fields streaked with mist, the horizon painted in grey-blue brushstrokes. Miss Marple sat still, gloved hands folded, eyes half closed but not asleep. There was a weight in her lap, faint but certain, the memory of a book that had never been there, yet left the impression all the same. She did not speak of it, nor glance at her notes, nor retrieve the pages she had carefully folded away. There are some conclusions, she knew, that must be carried quietly. That which is named too early has a way of changing shape. That which is remembered too late may never have truly left. In the station at the next village, a boy selling papers held one aloft. New bookshop brings life back to Emberley. It read in cheerful, blockish letters. She did not look, but in her pocket, unnoticed until now, was a fragment of torn parchment, the edge charred, the handwriting unmistakable. Just 3 words, no more. Open it carefully. Was it truly there? She could not say, but her hand brushed over it again and again during the journey, as though its weight held back something far greater. Back in Emberley, the new proprietor smiled at his first customer of the morning. A woman with silver hair and distant eyes held up a book. "There's no barcode," she murmured. He merely nodded. "Some books," he replied, "aren't meant to be scanned." A child passing the window paused and stared. "Mummy," he said, tugging her hand, "why's that book looking at me?" She hushed him, not understanding, and inside, tucked again at a perfect angle, the black-covered book now bore one more edition, in new ink, Volume 1. Rewatch Chapter 1. Notice the attic window in the very first pan. Who was standing there, and why? What do you think memory seeding really means? Comment your theory below. Miss Marple may return. Did you catch the man in grey in Chapter 3's background? Look again, he was never gone.